Man adopts a German Shepherd puppy, but then realizes shocking truth. The dense forest stretched endlessly, shrouded in early morning mist as Ethan Miller navigated the familiar trail. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and the towering pines swayed gently in the crisp autumn breeze. It was a routine hike, one he had done countless times before, a ritual that grounded him in a world that often felt too fast and chaotic. The solitude of the woods had always been a comfort, a place where he could breathe freely without the noise of city life pressing in. But today, something felt different. A strange stillness lingered in the air, an absence of bird song that made him slow his steps. Then he heard it, a faint, barely audible whimper. He stopped, heart pounding slightly as he strained to locate the source of the sound. It came again, weak and pleading, carried by the wind from somewhere deeper within the trees. Frowning, Ethan stepped off the well-worn path, pushing through the undergrowth, his boots sinking into the damp soil. His pulse quickened as he followed the sound, each step drawing him closer to something unseen. After a few minutes of searching, he spotted a small, trembling figure huddled beneath the exposed roots of a fallen tree. It was a puppy, no more than a few weeks old. Its thin body curled tightly against the cold ground. Its fur was dark, almost black, and its large amber eyes, wide with fear, locked onto Ethan's with an intensity that sent a shiver through him. The pup's ears twitched, its breath coming in short, ragged bursts. It was alone, vulnerable, and clearly starving. Ethan crouched slowly, his voice low and soothing. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay." The puppy flinched but didn't move away. Its tiny frame was shivering violently, and Ethan could see the faint rise and fall of its ribs beneath the too-thin fur. No collar, no signs of a mother nearby. Abandoned, most likely. The thought made his jaw tighten. He knew these woods well enough to recognize when an animal didn't belong. A domesticated puppy left out here alone? It wouldn't survive the night. Carefully, he removed his flannel jacket and extended it toward the pup. "Come on, let's get you warm." The puppy hesitated, eyes flicking between the fabric and his face, assessing. Then, as if deciding he was safe, it took an unsteady step forward. Ethan gently wrapped the jacket around its frail body, lifting it against his chest. The pup let out a small, exhausted sigh, its head resting against his shoulder as if it had finally allowed itself to give in to fatigue. The hike back felt longer than usual, the weight of the fragile creature in his arms grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. By the time he reached his cabin, the pup's shivering had lessened slightly, though its tiny paws were still icy against his arm. Inside, he set it down carefully on a pile of blankets near the fireplace, before quickly stoking the flames to chase away the lingering cold. The warm glow filled the room, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Ethan studied the puppy as it curled into the blankets, its breathing slow but steady. Something about it felt different. It wasn't just its striking eyes or the way it moved. Cautious but calculated, as if it were already assessing its surroundings, like a creature of instinct rather than mere habit. There was something almost wild in its demeanor, something that made Ethan pause. He let out a breath and ran a hand through his hair. "What are you?" he murmured. The puppy, half drowsy but still watchful, blinked at him. A name. He needed to give it a name. Something fitting. He glanced at the shadows dancing against the walls, their silent movements mirroring the way the pup had crept forward in the forest. Shadow, he decided softly. The name felt right. The pup didn't react, but something in its posture shifted as if acknowledging the choice. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm. Shadow, though weak at first, began to regain strength with proper food and rest. He ate cautiously, never lunging at the bowl like most starving animals might, but rather observing it first before approaching, a trait Ethan found peculiar. His movements were eerily silent for a puppy, his steps barely making a sound against the wooden floor. And then there were the nights. Nights when Shadow would sit by the window, staring out into the darkness with an expression far too knowing for a creature so young. It wasn't long before Ethan started noticing more signs that Shadow wasn't just an ordinary dog. His reaction to sounds was sharper than it should have been, his ears flicking toward noises Ethan himself barely registered. On one occasion, Shadow had stiffened suddenly during a walk, his body low to the ground, eyes locked on something unseen in the distance. Moments later, a deer had emerged from the brush, its presence unknown to Ethan until Shadow had sensed it first. Instinct. It ran deep in him, deeper than any puppy Ethan had ever encountered. One evening, as he sat on the porch with Shadow curled beside him, the pup lifted his head and let out a low, mournful howl that sent a chill through Ethan's spine. It wasn't the short, yipping sound of a dog learning to vocalize. It was something older, something raw and untamed, the sound of the wild. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring down at the dark-furred creature beside him. "What are you trying to tell me, huh?" Shadow merely blinked, his amber eyes reflecting the flickering porch light. Ethan wasn't sure he wanted the answer. The days stretched into weeks, and Shadow grew stronger with each passing sunrise. The once fragile pup that Ethan had cradled in his arms now moved with a confidence that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. His legs, once wobbly, had gained strength, his body filling out with lean muscle that hinted at a lineage far beyond that of a simple German shepherd. Ethan had seen dogs grow before, but never like this. Shadow moved with an eerie grace, each step silent, each glance filled with an awareness that felt almost unnatural. The pup barely made a sound, even on the creaky wooden floors of the cabin, his padded feet gliding as if he were weightless. But it wasn't just his movements, it was the way he watched the world. Ethan had begun taking Shadow on longer walks through the forest, watching as the pup navigated the landscape with an ease that made the woods feel like an extension of himself. He never hesitated, never stumbled, and always seemed to know exactly where he was going, even when Ethan deliberately changed paths. The leash he had bought remained unused, coiled on the hook by the door. Shadow didn't need it. He never strayed far, always aware of Ethan's presence. Yet there was a distance in his eyes, a pull towards something beyond the quiet life of the cabin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the clearing, Ethan noticed Shadow's ears twitch sharply. The pup's head snapped toward the edge of the forest, his entire body going rigid, muscles coiling like a spring about to be released. Ethan followed his gaze, but he saw nothing, just the same endless sprawl of trees and underbrush. "What is it, boy?" Ethan murmured, stepping closer, but Shadow remained frozen, his amber eyes locked on something unseen. Then, without warning, he let out a low, guttural growl. It was the first time Ethan had heard such a sound from him. It was deep, vibrating in the air like something ancient and primal. A warning. Ethan's pulse quickened as he scanned the trees, straining to see what Shadow sensed. Then, just as suddenly as he had tensed, Shadow relaxed, his body loosening, the growl fading into silence. He blinked up at Ethan before turning away, trotting toward the cabin as if nothing had happened. Ethan exhaled, shaking his head, but the unease lingered. Later that night, Ethan sat at his desk, scrolling through articles about German Shepherd behavior. He had trained dogs before, grown up with them his whole life, but Shadow didn't fit into any of the descriptions. He wasn't just intelligent, he was something else entirely. Wolves, Ethan thought suddenly, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. He glanced at Shadow, who lay curled near the fireplace, his dark coat blending into the flickering shadows. The thought was ridiculous. A wolf hybrid? That didn't just happen. Yet as he stared at the sleeping pup, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was slipping just beyond his reach. The following morning, Ethan decided to put his theory to the test. The air was crisp with the first hints of winter, frost clinging to the fallen leaves as he led Shadow deeper into the woods. The pup followed as he always did, never needing a command. Ethan watched his movements carefully, noting the way Shadow's nose twitched at scents unseen, the way his ears flicked at the faintest rustle. When they reached a clearing, Ethan crouched and pulled a small, frozen rabbit carcass from his pack. It was something he had found near the river days ago, likely the remains of a predator's meal, but it would serve his purpose now. He placed it on the ground and stepped back, watching. Most puppies would hesitate, unsure of what to do. Shadow did not. He lowered his head, sniffing once before sinking his teeth into the frozen flesh with an ease that sent a chill through Ethan's spine. There was no hesitation, no confusion, only instinct. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew dogs. He knew their behaviors. And this wasn't the behavior of a simple domesticated pup. Shadow had the instincts of a hunter. That night, as they sat on the porch, Ethan found himself talking aloud. "You're not just a dog, are you?" he muttered, half expecting Shadow to answer. The pup only flicked his ears, gazing out into the darkened trees. The wind carried the distant cry of something wild, a howl, long and mournful, drifting from deep within the forest. Shadow's ears perked sharply. Then, to Ethan's shock, he lifted his head and answered. The sound was haunting, raw and untamed. It wasn't the bark of a dog, nor was it fully a wolf's call, but something in between, a bridge between two worlds. The hairs on Ethan's arms rose as the sound echoed into the night, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. Shadow's body remained still, his eyes reflecting the distant stars, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of the truth settle in his chest. Shadow was not meant for a leash. He was not meant for fenced yards and suburban neighborhoods. He was something else, something wild, something ancient. But he had chosen to stay. That, more than anything, left Ethan feeling both relieved and unsettled. If Shadow ever decided to leave, to follow the pull of the wilderness, calling to him in the night, could Ethan stop him? Would he even have the right to? As if sensing his thoughts, Shadow lowered his head, resting it on Ethan's knee with a quiet sigh. Ethan exhaled, running his fingers through the thick fur between Shadow's ears. "We'll figure this out," he murmured, "one way or another." The firelight flickered in the cabin window behind them, a warm contrast to the chill of the night. In the distance, the woods stretched endlessly, a world of unknowns waiting just beyond reach. And somewhere out there, perhaps in the shadows between trees, something was waiting. Something that had always been calling to Shadow. The first snow of the season arrived overnight, blanketing the forest in a quiet, glistening white. Ethan awoke to the muffled stillness that only winter could bring, the kind of silence that made the world feel untouched, as though it had been reset. He rolled out of bed, pulling on his sweater before stepping onto the cold wooden floor. Shadow was already awake, sitting by the cabin's front door, his ears perked, his amber eyes locked onto the snowfall outside. Ethan watched him for a moment, noting the way his breath fogged against the glass, his body tense with an anticipation that Ethan didn't quite understand. "You want to go out?" he murmured, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Shadow didn't move at first, but then his tail flicked once, a slow and deliberate motion, as if he had only just realized Ethan was watching. Opening the door, Ethan stepped back as Shadow padded out, his dark paws pressing silently into the untouched snow. He moved like a shadow cast across the frost, his black coat stark against the white expanse. Ethan followed, inhaling deeply as the crisp air filled his lungs. The morning light was soft, filtering through the skeletal branches of the trees, casting long, pale blue shadows across the ground. Shadow moved ahead, his nose to the air, his body drawn forward by something unseen. Ethan let him lead, trusting the strange intuition that had become a part of their routine. There was always something uncanny about the way Shadow navigated the forest, as if he already knew where they were going before they had even decided to move. The hike carried them deeper than usual, past familiar trails and into the heart of the wilderness, where the trees stood ancient and untouched. Shadow's pace never faltered, but Ethan felt something shift in the air, something pressing against the quiet, a presence just beyond the veil of what was visible. He had never been the superstitious type, never one to think of the woods as anything more than trees and earth. But with Shadow at his side, the forest had begun to feel different, alive in ways he hadn't noticed before. And then Shadow stopped. His body stiffened, his head lowering slightly, ears trained forward. Ethan followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Only the vast white of the clearing ahead, the stillness of winter pressing in on all sides. Then a sound, so faint that Ethan barely caught it, an exhale, slow and measured, like the breath of something waiting. Shadow's lips curled back slightly, his body sinking into a stance that was neither aggressive nor fearful, but something in between, something instinctive. Ethan's heart thudded against his ribs as he felt the same sensation he had felt the first time he found Shadow in the woods, that same eerie pull of something just beyond his understanding. He forced himself to breathe. "What is it, boy?" His voice felt too loud in the hush of the snow-covered world. Shadow did not answer. Instead, he took a step forward, deliberate and silent. Ethan hesitated but followed, his boots crunching against the frost as they moved into the clearing. That's when he saw them. Eyes watching from the tree line, blending into the shadows between the pines. Not one pair but several, golden and piercing, fixed on them with an unreadable intensity. Wolves. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face as he realized just how close they were. He had seen wolves before, from a distance, rare glimpses that never lasted more than a heartbeat. But this was different. They were not running, they were waiting. Shadow did not move. He stood between Ethan and the pack, his body still, ears twitching as if listening to something Ethan could not hear. The largest of the wolves stepped forward, its coat a mix of silver and black, its eyes reflecting the early morning light like molten gold. It was enormous, its frame lean but powerful, every movement fluid and precise. Ethan could barely swallow, his pulse roaring in his ears. He knew better than to run, knew that fear was the worst thing to show, but standing there, staring into the eyes of something so undeniably wild, he felt small in a way he hadn't felt before. The wolf took another step closer, and then, to Ethan's absolute shock, Shadow moved toward it. "Shadow! No!" Ethan hissed. But the pup did not stop. He walked forward, his steps slow and unthreatening, his tail low but not tucked, his ears forward but not rigid. It was not submission. It was something else entirely. Recognition. The large wolf exhaled, a visible puff of steam curling from its nose as it watched Shadow approach. The others remained still, their eyes flicking between Ethan and the pup with an awareness that sent shivers down his spine. Shadow paused just feet away from the massive creature, his head tilting slightly, his amber eyes locked onto the wolf's in a silent exchange that Ethan could not comprehend. The moment stretched, heavy and taut like a thread about to snap. Then the wolf let out a sound, a low, rumbling huff. Not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. A test, an acknowledgement. Shadow did not flinch. He held his ground, his own breath steady and measured. Then, just as suddenly as the moment had begun, the wolf turned, moving back into the trees with a slow, effortless stride. The others followed, one by one, until the clearing was empty again, the silence closing in like a held breath finally released. Shadow stood still for a moment longer, before finally turning back to Ethan, his expression unreadable, his golden eyes still holding the weight of whatever had just passed between them. Ethan let out a shaky exhale, his mind spinning. He had just witnessed something ancient, something that did not belong to him or to the world he understood. They walked back to the cabin in silence, Shadow padding beside him as if nothing had happened, as if the encounter had not changed something irrevocably between them. But Ethan knew better. That night, as Shadow lay by the fire, Ethan sat in his chair, staring at him with the weight of a realization he had been trying to avoid since the beginning. Shadow did not just have the instincts of a wild creature. He was a wild creature. The question was no longer whether Shadow belonged in his home, but whether Ethan had the right to keep him at all. The cold settled deep into the valley, an unrelenting force that painted the forest in frost and silence. Ethan sat on the porch, his breath curling in soft plumes as he stared at the tree line where the wolves had vanished days ago. He had replayed that moment in his mind countless times, the way Shadow had moved toward them with a quiet confidence, as if he had been answering a call only he could hear. The encounter had left Ethan with more questions than answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at him like a slow, steady drip of water against stone. Shadow, meanwhile, had not changed, at least not in any way Ethan could easily define. He still followed him into town when supplies were needed, still curled by the fire at night, still pressed against Ethan's side with that silent, unwavering loyalty. But there was something in his eyes now, a depth that hadn't been there before, as if part of him had begun to unravel a truth Ethan wasn't ready to face. It was late afternoon when Ethan decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed his coat, the heavy woolen one lined with fleece, and slung his rifle over his shoulder, not for Shadow, not for the wolves, but because winter was here, and in these mountains, food grew scarce for more than just men. Shadow watched him, ears flicking, his body poised as if he already knew what Ethan was planning. "We're going back," Ethan murmured, fastening the last button of his coat. Shadow didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, moving ahead as they entered the woods, his dark coat blending into the growing shadows cast by the low-hanging sun. The hike was silent except for the crunch of frost beneath their steps. The deeper they went, the more the unease settled in Ethan's gut, a weight heavier than the rifle across his back. This wasn't like any other time he had tracked through these woods. This time, he wasn't the one leading. Shadow guided him, taking turns with quiet certainty, moving through the underbrush as if following something Ethan could neither see nor hear. He no longer questioned how Shadow knew where to go. He only questioned what they would find when they got there. They reached the clearing faster than Ethan expected, the same place where the wolves had watched them days ago. The snow was disturbed, tracks pressed into the frozen ground, some belonging to deer, others to something far heavier. A fresh kill lay half buried in the frost, its scent sharp in the frigid air. A stag, its body torn open, ribs exposed to the sky like skeletal fingers reaching for something unseen. The kill was fresh, the blood still bright against the white, but there were no scavengers, no crows or foxes daring to claim what remained. Only silence. Shadow approached first, his nose twitching, his ears forward. He did not growl. He did not hesitate. Instead, he dipped his head, scenting the air in slow, deliberate movements. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle, scanning the trees, his pulse loud in his ears. He had seen wolf kills before, had found the remnants of their hunts scattered through these woods over the years. But this felt different. It wasn't the messiness of survival. It was something calculated, a warning, then movement. Not in front of them, but behind. A rustle of branches, the shift of snow collapsing beneath something heavy. Ethan turned sharply, heart hammering, but Shadow was faster. He spun, his body lowering, muscles coiled tight like a spring about to snap. A shadow moved between the trees, then another, and another. The wolves had returned. Ethan's fingers tensed around the rifle stock, but he didn't raise it. He knew better. Knew that if they had wanted to attack, they would have done so already. This wasn't an ambush. This was something else entirely. The largest of the pack emerged first, the same massive wolf from before, his silver and black coat rippling as he moved forward with a measured grace. His golden eyes locked onto Shadow, ignoring Ethan entirely. The others followed, circling in slow, deliberate steps, their forms weaving between the trees like ghosts of something older than time itself. Ethan could feel his heartbeat in his throat. He willed himself to stay still, to not reach for the rifle, to not make a single move that could be mistaken as a threat. This was not his fight. It never had been. It had always been about Shadow. The large wolf stopped mere feet from them, his breath visible in the cold. Then he did something Ethan did not expect. He lowered his head. Not in submission, but in something resembling acknowledgement. Shadow did not hesitate. He stepped forward, meeting the wolf's gaze without fear, without doubt, without question. The two stared at each other, unmoving, locked in a silent exchange that Ethan could never hope to understand. Then, as if reaching an unspoken agreement, the wolf turned. The others followed, their movements fluid, effortless, a whisper of something primal against the frozen earth. And Shadow hesitated. He stood there watching as they disappeared into the trees, his breath slow and steady, his body still but poised, as if caught between two worlds that had finally collided. Ethan swallowed hard. He already knew what was coming before Shadow even turned to look at him. Choice. The Shadow's body tensed, his gaze flicking between Ethan and the fading figures of the pack. His tail flicked once, a ghost of uncertainty, but only for a moment. Then he took a step forward, and another. Ethan felt something deep in his chest twist, something he had been denying since the moment he found Shadow in the woods. He had never truly been his. He had only been borrowing him. Shadow stopped just at the edge of the trees, glancing back one last time. Ethan exhaled, the cold biting at his lungs. "Go," he whispered. Shadow's ears flicked, and then he turned, disappearing into the forest without another sound. Ethan stood there for a long time, long after the last trace of movement had faded into the vastness of the wilderness. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant howl of a wolf, rising and falling in the endless stretch of trees. It was not a goodbye, it was a beginning. The days that followed were quiet, unbearably so. The cabin felt emptier than it had in years, the absence of soft paw steps against the wooden floor, pressing down on Ethan like a weight he couldn't shake. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the space that now felt too large, too still. He caught himself glancing at the door out of habit, expecting to see a dark silhouette waiting patiently to come inside. But Shadow was gone. He had made his choice, and Ethan had been the one to tell him to go. It was what was right. It was what was fair. But knowing that didn't make the silence any easier to bear. Winter deepened, turning the valley into an expanse of white and ice. The snow piled high against the trees. The river slowed to a sluggish crawl beneath frozen layers, and the wind howled through the ridges with a voice that never quite sounded human, never quite sounded animal. It was something in between, something wild and untamed. Ethan spent his days trying to fall back into routine, chopping wood, repairing the cabin, hiking the trails that had once felt like home. But now every step felt heavier. Every path led him somewhere he wasn't sure he wanted to go. His mind wandered constantly to the moment Shadow had disappeared into the trees, his dark coat blending into the wilderness that had always been calling him. Nights were the hardest. When the world outside was silent and the fire cast long shadows along the walls, Ethan found himself straining to hear something, anything. He listened for the familiar sound of a soft whine, for the rhythmic breathing curled near his bed, for the weight of something watching over him in the dark. But nothing came. It wasn't regret that gnawed at him, not exactly. It was something deeper, something more difficult to name. He had spent so long believing that Shadow was meant to be his, that he had saved him, that they belonged together. But now, standing in the empty cabin, he realized that it had always been the other way around. Shadow had been the one to find him. Shadow had been the one to remind him what it meant to have something worth holding on to. Weeks passed, then months. The snow softened, the ice melted. The first signs of spring crept through the cold with stubborn persistence. The forest woke slowly, as if shaking off the weight of winter, the scent of damp earth rising as the trees shed their frozen silence. Ethan found himself outside more often, not because he had to be, but because something in him needed it. He wandered farther than usual, hiking paths he hadn't taken in years, following no particular destination. He told himself he wasn't searching. He told himself he was simply walking, but his eyes always drifted to the edges of the tree line. His ears always listened for something beyond the usual rustle of leaves and distant call of birds. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in golden ember, he saw it, a shadow against the trees, still and waiting. Ethan's breath caught, his heart slamming once against his ribs before settling into a slow, unsteady rhythm. Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, his black coat glossy in the fading light, his body taller, stronger, wilder. He was different, and yet he wasn't. His golden eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, without a sound, Shadow stepped forward. Ethan didn't speak. He wasn't sure he could. He simply stood there, letting the moment stretch between them like something fragile, something neither of them wanted to break. Shadow closed the distance in slow, careful steps, his body language unreadable. He stopped a few feet away, his ears flicking back briefly before he let out a breath. A quiet, familiar sigh that made something in Ethan's chest unclench. The wind shifted, carrying the distant howl of wolves far in the distance, but Shadow didn't turn toward it. He only watched Ethan, waiting. The choice had been his before. It was still his now. Ethan crouched slowly, extending a hand, palm up, an offering rather than a command. Shadow hesitated for only a second before he stepped forward, pressing his forehead lightly against Ethan's knuckles. The warmth of him was real, solid, grounding in a way Ethan hadn't realized he needed until that exact moment. He exhaled, his fingers threading gently through the thick fur behind Shadow's ears, feeling the quiet strength beneath his touch. "Welcome back," Ethan murmured, the words barely more than a breath. Shadow huffed softly, something close to contentment in his expression. He wasn't the same pup Ethan had found trembling in the roots of an old tree. He wasn't the same uncertain creature caught between two worlds. He had chosen the wild, but he had also chosen this. Chosen Ethan. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Because there was something between them that went beyond instinct, beyond ownership, beyond what either of them could fully explain. Ethan straightened, patting Shadow once before stepping back toward the cabin. He didn't look behind him to see if Shadow would follow. He didn't have to. He already knew. The sound of soft paws against the earth, the steady presence at his side, the quiet understanding between them. It was all there, just as it had always been, just as it always would be. As the night settled in, Ethan stoked the fire, the warmth filling the cabin once more. He glanced down as Shadow curled beside the hearth, his body relaxed, his golden eyes half-lidded with quiet contentment. The wind outside shifted again, another distant howl carrying through the trees, but this time, Shadow did not answer. He only flicked an ear, exhaled, and rested his head against his paws. The wild was still in him. It always would be. But so was this. So was home.